This is a Dhammanet presentation.
So I'll talk a little bit about the Buddha and some of the events in his life. And along the way I might touch on the question of karma, maybe. Let's see how we go. Actually, I was just reminded of some of those episodes when I was, the last few days I've been doing a bit of work for Sutta Central on compiling a list of Sutta quotes for Sutta Central. And this was a list that was originally made by Venerable Yuttadhammo. And it's actually got a lot of nicely chosen quotes. And one of the ones which was included there, which I was reminded of, was the story where the Buddha came across the sick monk in the monastery. I'm sure many of you may have heard this story, but it's very, to me, it's a very beautiful one. And the Buddha was just wandering around the monastery, looking at checking out the monastery and how it was. And it's one of those stories that you can sort of really sort of imagine what it was like, you know. And so the Buddha's wandering around with an under, and then they came across a monk who was in a hut, and he's just lying there, sick and soiled in his own bed. He had dysentery. And the Buddha said, what's going on? He said, well, I'm sick. And he said, why don't the monks look after me? And he said, well, I'm no use to the monks, so they don't look after me. And so the Buddha said to Ananda, come, let's look after this monk. So they picked him up and they cleaned him off, made fresh bedding for him, and made sure that he was comfortable. And then afterwards he called the monks together and said, monks, what's going on? Why didn't you help that monk? And they said, well, he wasn't any use to us. So very honest people. So he said, monks, you should look after the sick. And anybody who would look after me should look after the sick. And obviously that was particularly important in the monastic community. So we've sort of left our family and we're living together. And there's something about that which is quite special. I mean, on the one hand, looking after the sick is something that's very ordinary, right? I mean, there are millions of people doing it today, right? Who are just ordinary people. They're kind and they're helpful and so on, but they're not great enlightened beings or special spiritual masters or anything. It's just ordinary human kindness. And they do all kinds of messy and ugly and unpleasant jobs. Right? Sometimes they do it because they're paid, nurses and carers and so on. And sometimes they do it because they're family. And sometimes they do it just because they're kind people. And so in a sense it's just very ordinary. There's nothing special about it at all. And yet somehow we're struck when we find the Buddha doing that. Right? It seems almost surprising or something. I'm not sure why that should be. Why should it be surprising that somebody who's a spiritual master should actually be just doing an ordinary act of kindness? Right? You kind of think of the Buddha as being somehow beyond that. But he wasn't. He wasn't beyond just helping people. In fact, he used to do that all the time. And that kind of attitude to say, we're not doing anything because he's no use to us. I mean, it's pretty shocking to find that in a monastic community, right? But, this is a Vinaya story. So in the Vinaya, obviously you hear all the stories of monks when they misbehave, right? And nuns when they misbehave, of course. So that's all the uninspiring stories gathered in the Vinaya. But it's also kind of, I think, reflects a lot of social attitudes as well, doesn't it? Right? I mean, we don't help people unless they're any use to us. I mean, it's a reality. And there's this kind of struggle to acknowledge, and I think a slow movement in our society to be able to extend our kindness towards people who are disadvantaged. And I think this is one of the marks of a civilized society, to be able to be in a place where, for example, we treat disabled people with dignity and respect. And I think that that's something which we have got better at doing. I think we're far from perfect, but I think we've made some improvements. To treat people who are older with dignity and respect. Something we're probably, I don't know if we are getting better at doing, or possibly getting worse at doing that. And what about treating people who are different? Gay people, transgender people, We're probably getting a little bit better at dealing with those things. Different sexualities. So some in some ways are moving forward. But then other cases we seem to be moving backwards. The treatment of asylum seekers, for example, has gone from harsh to brutal. And we sometimes forget that when people come, then they're your guest. And one of the great values and great civilized virtues of any society, we find this in Buddhism and also in other places, is to respect guests and respect travellers. And so the ability to just treat everyone, no matter who they are, with some common decency and some kindness and some respect. And this is why we have agreements like the United Nations human rights for prisoners of war. I mean, even prisoners of war you're supposed to treat with a certain degree of, common decency. But we don't seem to grant that to asylum seekers these days. So I think that the power of that act by the Buddha was in a sense it's just a simple act of kindness and it's nothing special. But I think the fact that it's the Buddha doing it is giving that demonstration that even from that point of the most profound and most transcendent wisdom, you don't kind of go beyond ordinary human decency. Being a spiritual master isn't an excuse for being, I don't know, for being neglectful or not caring about people's well-being. And that kind of treatment is something that we find consistently throughout the everything that the Buddha did. And when one of the things, looking at the suttas and looking through it, you find how consistent and kind and reasonable that everything that the Buddha did was. He's constantly talking about things like how do you act in a way that's loving and kind with your family? How do you create harmony between people? How do you become somebody who's respected for their generosity? And all of these ways of using these kind of positive actions in order to create a better world is something which we find constantly. And there's kind of very practical guidelines in these things. And even when the Buddha was subject to very terrible attacks, like when Devadatta attacked him and various other kinds of cases, then he would respond, but he would respond with moderation and with dignity. Right? He didn't let himself get bullied by Devadatta, but he would respond with dignity. So, for example, at one stage after Devadatta tried to kill him and so on, he told Sariputta to go and to make an announcement in the village that Devadatta was not to be identified or considered to be part of the Buddhist community anymore. Right? It's nothing to do with us. Right? And but there's a very mild response, right? He wasn't sort of denouncing him and condemning him or anything like that. He's saying, look, what he does is his own. Don't let that reflect on the Sangha. And then Sariputta said, well, formerly I used to praise Devadatta and said he was a very mighty and powerful meditator with great psychic powers. So what about that? And the Buddha said, well, was that true when you said it? He said, yeah. He said, is this true what you're saying now? He said, yeah. So he said, there's not a problem. So it can be okay to make these kinds of things and to stand up for yourself and to say what's true and what's going to be beneficial. But you can do that without sort of getting into nastiness and hurtful things and all of this kind of stuff. So Buddhism is absolutely a religion of kindness, right from the beginning right through to the end. And if we look at the way that the Buddha lived and the way that he structured his community, one of the most amazing things about it is how anti-hierarchical it is. I'm reminded of this with Beatrice's study on dogs and dog people and cat people. Well, I'm not sure what the Buddha would be. Would the Buddha be a dog person or a cat person? Well, he'd probably be a cat. I don't know. He was compared to be like a lion. They never compared him to being like a dog. So I guess he'd have to be a lion person. Yeah. Big cat. Yeah, and I think it's important to appreciate how radical and how fully that the Buddha embodied these principles. I mean, if you put yourself back in ancient India, of course, you have the caste system, right, which creates these strata in society and so on. Actually, the caste system in ancient India wasn't as fixed and as complex as it is today, or that it became over the years. And it was much more similar to the class system that you had, say, in medieval Europe, where you had like the religious class and the knights and the farmers and so on and so forth. And there's quite rigid social boundaries, but not as sort of inflexible as it became in later years. And so within this kind of thing, you have this whole kind of system which sets up structure in society. And I think it's important to understand that these things don't come from nowhere and they don't serve no purpose. Okay, so we need structure in our society, right? There needs to be something that keeps some kind of order happening in your society. And the question is, how does that manifest? Right? How do you do that? And so the typical way that that's done is to say that there are people in power and that there are people who don't. People who've got power, people who don't have power, and the people who don't have power are subject to those who do have power. That's how things tend to devolve in human society. And those who are in power usually control language and speech and ideas, and they create the ideas that will justify their power and justify them exerting their power over people who don't. And so the Buddha came in and just wiped all that off. There's no hierarchy in the Vinaya. No? It's quite astonishing. There's not a single thing in the Vinaya which is based on hierarchy and seniority. It doesn't exist. And this is not an accident. This is a very deliberate choice by the Buddha. When I say that there's not a single thing, that's not quite correct. There are one or two things. There's if you're senior, you should be able to take your food first, and you shouldn't be denied a dwelling place if you're a senior as well. So you shouldn't throw out the senior monks and nuns to live in the forest if there's a hut for them. And there's a kind of presumption that a senior monastic must or has the right to speak first in an assembly. Okay, I don't know if that's ever coded as a rule anywhere, but it seems to be kind of assumed. And that's it. That's about it. There's no other rules, and there's plenty of places where you're actually not allowed to enforce hierarchy.
What about the bowing?
Right, so bowing is a gesture of respect. yeah, but it's not a gesture of power. Yeah, so there's a difference there. So we bow to a Buddha image out of respect, but I don't then listen to orders from the Buddha image.
But bowing to each other.
But we also bow to each other, yeah. Again, it's as a gesture of respect, but not a gesture of power. Yeah. So there's these two things. On the one hand, in the power relations are entirely flat, whereas there's a respect to elders and respect to seniority. And so seniors are regarded as being, the phrase is used is sota bang manyati, yeah, which is worth listening to, right? So, if the seniors are speaking, then you should listen to them with respect, okay? But that's, of course, never says that they should be obeyed, right? Never says that you should do what they say, but you should listen to what they say. Yeah? And even in cases where people didn't do what the Buddha said, yeah. And classic case is the Meghiya Sutta, which I've spoken about Meghiya Sutta a number of times. I'm not sure if is everyone familiar with that. I don't want to repeat myself too much. No, yes, no, yeah, okay, no, okay. Meghiya Sutta in the Udana. It's one of the nicest suttas actually, and it's quite a short one, but it's got a very rich context. And the Buddha had his attendant called Meghiya, and Meghiya means cloudy actually, and this must have been in the early part of the Buddha's life, before Ananda became his attendant. And the Buddha was walking through the countryside, and they walked past a mango grove. And Meghiya said, later to the Buddha, he said, "Oh, that mango grove was very nice. I'd like to go there for meditation." And the Buddha said, "Wait until some other monks come, and then you can maybe go." Now, the strangest thing I find about this story is, who wants to meditate in a mango grove? Mango groves are terrible places to meditate. Because of the ants, for a start, yeah. I don't know in India, but in Thailand, there's all these big biting red ants that come and they eat all the mangoes and they make these big nests, and they see you running, they like leap screaming in their halls, ready to rip your flesh off you. In Thailand, they eat the eggs from those things. It's like the caviar of northeast Thailand. They get the eggs from these nests. Yeah. And also other animals, birds and things like that, monkeys and things would come for the mangoes. So I'm not sure that it sounds like a great place to meditate. But anyway, Meghiya wanted to go and meditate there. Fine. So, and the Buddha said no. So what's going on, right? Why does the Buddha not want Meghiya to go off in seclusion and meditate? And the second time he asks, and the third time he asks, and the Buddha says, "Well, you speak of going off to do some meditation, so what can I say?" So he just went off anyway, right? I mean, really? You're with the Buddha, and the Buddha gives you some meditation instructions, and you just ignore him? We have this idea that, things would be so much better if only we were in the Buddha's time, right? If the Buddha was there, he could teach us and so on. But if the Buddha was there, you'd be just as stubborn and stupid as you are now. I hate to say it. Yeah, that's just the reality. So he went off meditate, and his meditation was crap. And he sat there and tried to meditate, and his mind's consumed with all of these evil thoughts all day. And so he went back to see the Buddha. Obviously, the Buddha said, "Nah, nah, 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 nah." I'm sure he would have said that, but they cut that bit out of the text, so we don't have that in the text as we have it now. But anyway, I would have said that if it was me. So he comes and he says to him, "Well, there are these qualities which help the heart's maturity for somebody who's not their practice is not mature." And the most important one of the things that he mentions there is having kalyana mitta, having good friendship, spiritual companions, people around you who can support you, who can advise you, who can tell you what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, and who can just be there in your spiritual practice. And this is like really, really important. If you don't have that, there's this kind of ideal that you can sort of wander off into the forest or into a cave and just sort of meditate on the top of a mountain, something like that. And for some people, it's great, but it's pretty rare to find somebody who really will thrive doing that in the long term. For short periods of time, I think it's okay, but it's rare to find somebody. Most of the time, most people actually benefit from having a spiritual community around. And I think most of us, if we're to be honest with ourselves, are rather less like someone like, say, Mahakassapa or Upalawana or something like that, who were sort of very powerful and advanced meditators. And we're rather less like that and rather more like Megia, who are kind of stubborn and foolish and go the wrong way, disobey our teacher and go off, and it doesn't really work. But at least, give Megia his due, right? At least he proved for himself that it didn't work. Otherwise, he would have just had to believe what the Buddha said, right? And maybe it would have been quicker, but anyway, I think good on him. He found out for himself. And what was interesting in that, there's no sense that, well, I'm the Buddha, you have to do what I say, right? The Buddha's giving him advice, and when he didn't want to keep it, that's all right. He wasn't asking to do anything bad or unwholesome. He was just a bit ill-advised. And then after the Buddha taught him about the Kalyana Mitra, he then gave him some teachings on meditation, and particularly he taught 4 kinds of meditation. Breath meditation for stilling thinking, metta meditation for overcoming anger, contemplation of the body for overcoming attachment to the body, and contemplation of impermanence for overcoming the conceit of a self. Yeah? So these 4 meditations that the Buddha taught at that time, it's a very beautiful and very powerful framework for meditation. And I think all of those, we should all have those 4 meditations in our repertoire as meditators. Yeah? Metta, breath meditation, metta, body contemplation, and contemplation of impermanence. Yeah? So they should all be there in the mix in some way or the other. So that's the Meghiya Sutta, and like another example of how the Buddha did things. Another example of that would be the quarrel in Kosambi. And that was another very sort of telling and very interesting episode in the life of the Buddha, where the Buddha's staying in Kosambi and the monks were having an argument. Right? What were they having an argument about? Right? What they were having an argument about was whether it was allowable to leave water in the water dipper in the toilet. Okay? Now you might think that sounds implausible, which would probably show that you haven't lived in a monastery. Because when you're living in a monastery, that kind of thing happens all the time. I think there's something about being in a monastery where you're because it's so insular, all those kind of tiny little things just loom very large, right? I mean, it can happen just in a home and so on as well, can't it, right? You just think, who's leaving the toilet seat up or whatever. But in this particular case, there's actually a little bit more. It is very silly, and I don't want to say that it's not silly, because it is, but it's not 100% as silly as it sounds, because the question was about, because if you leave the water in there, then mosquitoes can breed in there. And then you can have the mosquito larvae. And then, so if you're throwing the water away, then are you killing them? So, of course, one group would argue, and they'd argue back and forth, well, it was only there for a very short time, so they wouldn't have bred then there, and so on and so forth, and back again. And then one group is like the Dhamma experts, and one group is like the Vinaya experts, and this is an offence, and then this isn't an offence, and they're back and forth and so on. And they were and the whole Sangha fell apart in quarrelling like that. And the Buddha tried to calm them down. He said, monks, just chill. Please, just calm down. And he tried repeatedly to do this. And he just didn't get anywhere. And they said to him, you, Buddha, you don't care, you don't worry about this. This is our dispute. You just have a nice meditation, and we will worry about this argument. Huh? actually, Kosambi, interestingly enough, the quarrel was at Kosambi, and because of that, Kosambi became in the Buddhist tradition in later years, it became like almost like a sort of a special locus or the site for the ending of Buddhism, right? And there's a whole cycle of myths which revolve around Kosambi, which is set in the far future and tell the story of how Buddhism comes to disappear in the world. I won't go into detail in those stories, but the essence of it, and this story is one you don't find in the Pali tradition, but you find repeatedly in the northern traditions, different variations, and it evolved and so on. But basically, the story goes that at some far time in the future, there'll be a righteous king who will call together the Sangha for a big ceremony in Kosambi, and all the Sangha will come from all different parts of India, and they'll gather together there. And the elder monk in that community, it will be the most senior monk in all of India. Now, one of the monks who came for that was one who'd been meditating alone in the Himalayas, and his students or something like that had called him down, and he'd specially come down, and no one had seen him for years, and he came down for that meeting. So they had this meeting, and they were supposed to recite the Patimokkha, right? So the fortnightly, the monks recite the Patimokkha, and they acknowledge their transgressions and their Vinaya faults and things like that. And one of the things about the Patimokkha is that if the monks aren't keeping the rules, then you can't really do it, right? It can only be done when the assembly is pure, which means if people have actually confessed their offence and so on. But if everybody shared the same offences and nobody's doing anything about it, then you can't purify the assembly through confession, and you can't hold the apposita. This is what happened in the time of King Ashoka. So when they were about to hold the apposita, then the senior most monk looked around all the monks, and there's like thousands of monks there, and he said, nobody here keeps the Vinaya. We can't do the apposita. All right? This is kind of shocking, sort of reverberated through the Sangha, you know, and this monk who'd come down from the Himalayas spoke up, and he said, ever since I've been ordained, I've never done as much as harm a blade of grass. Right? Breaking a blade of grass is a Vinaya offence. He says, I've never done a Vinaya offence even as much as breaking a blade of grass. And so then all the monks who were students of that senior monk got really angry with him. It was like he's sort of putting this other monk down, and then they're sort of fighting and so on. And then this mass brawl broke out among the monks, and they started murdering each other until eventually all of the Sangha was murdered, dead. And there's just a pile of corpses of monks there. And then the king comes along and says, oh, I must have had very bad karma, because in my reign Buddhism has come to an end in such a terrible way. So that, according to many opinions of Buddhists, is how they imagine Buddhism is going to come to an end. Right? Yeah, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? So anyway, there's a story. There was a interesting book done on it by Jan Natty, who wrote a book, Once Upon a Future Time, which discusses that legend and the different implications of it. So well worth a read if you get the chance. Anyway, so that's just a bit by the by, really. Anyway, so back to Kosambi. So the Buddha eventually was so annoyed with everybody that, I don't know if he was really annoyed, but anyway, he decided to leave. So he went off and went back and meditated in the forest. And that was that very famous episode where he went to the Parileya forest, and then the elephant and the monkey came and offered him food. And just in case you think that could never happen, there are actually monasteries in Thailand where monkeys will come and offer the food to the monks. So it does happen.
Where do the monkeys get the food?
I don't know. From them. What do you mean where they get the food? They get it from Monkey Donald's.
Are they trained like in
Trained
those
monkeys,
Japanese restaurants where they have monkey waiters?
Do they have monkey waiters in Japanese restaurants?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
I thought that was what you're referring to.
Well, it would be something similar to that.
Something like that.
They're trained. They're like, The story that I've heard was it was a monkey or a gibbon or something like that, but they'd been like an orphan or something like that, and they'd ended up in the monastery, and they'd been trained and looked up, brought up by the monks and things. So yeah, I mean, you don't see it very often, but it does happen. Yeah. So, where was I? Monkey and elephant offering the dana. Okay, and then the Buddha wandered on further, and he came to the Gosinga wood forest, and there he met. And there was a very lovely sutta. One of the, if among all the monks, like one of the favorite suttas for all the monks is the Chula Gosinga Sutta, right? And that's one sutta that we really love. And so in that sutta, the Buddha walked into the Gosinga wood forest, and there was 3 monks there meditating, Anuruddha, Kimbila, and Nandiya. And they had a monastery attendant who was helping to look after the monastery. And the monks had given this attendant the instructions, don't let anybody come in. We're on retreat, right? So if anybody comes, tell them they can't come in. And so the Buddha walks in through to the monastery, and the monastery attendant says, "Oi, out of here! You can't come in." And then the monks say, "No, not him, silly. He's allowed to come in." So the Buddha came in and he talked to the monks about their practice and so on, and they gave a description of the way that they live together, which is just so beautiful and so nice. And they say, they get up in the morning and they come, and they whichever one of them is first sets out the eating places and so on for the day, and it's beautiful because there's not like a roster, right? It's not like somebody has to do this and do this and this, but whoever's first does that, and this is how we just live together. And then they fill up the water pots and so on, and you check to see where other mats clean, and it just goes all the details in the life. And it says if the water pot's too big for one person to move by himself, then he'll gesture with his hand for the other one to help. But we don't need to break out into speech just to do that. Yeah. So all of this is just done mindfully and in silence to live together and do all of those basic chores. They prepare things, and then when they're ready, they'll go out into the village for alms, wander for alms. They come back again. Whichever one is first will set things and get things ready, and whichever one is last will clean up and put all the scraps aside and make everything clean and put it away. And that's how they live their life. And the Buddha says, what else do you do? And they said, well, every 5 days they sit all night and talk about Dhamma. Yeah? So that was their practice. They didn't have like someone who's there as a teacher who's teaching the others or whatever. Right? So there's no leader of the community. It's just a group of friends who are staying together and meditating, and they would sit and discuss the Dhamma. And then for the rest of the time they just do their practice and be in seclusion. So they weren't like keeping a vow of silence or anything like that, but they just didn't speak unless it was necessary. And when it was necessary, they would talk about Dhamma. And then the Buddha said, doing this, have you realized anything like really cool stuff? Like, and they said, well, and then Anuruddha said, well, actually, when I practice like this, then whenever I want to, I go into the first jhana. And one of the interesting things also there was that the other monks say, wow, we never knew that you'd got to the first jhana. Right? So that's how humble they were, right? Even though they talk about Dhamma and so on, they weren't sitting there saying, wow, I had this really great meditation and so on. But they just talk about Dhamma. It's all impersonal, yeah? And they're just supporting each other. So and then the Buddha says, oh, you got first jhana, that's really good. You got anything else? He said, well, yeah, actually, whenever I want, I go into second jhana too. And he says, oh, that's really good. He says, what about anything else? He says, well, third jhana too. And then it goes up, and of course it turns out he's an arahant, but he sort of has to be teased out of him little bit by little bit, right? To sort of, before he gets to the final point, you realise that he's an arahant. And the Buddha said, if the people in this village that you go for alms, if they were to recollect and to understand the level of practice that you're doing, and the purity and the harmony of the life that you're living together, then that would be a great benefit for them. If people everywhere in the world were to recollect that practice and that purity of mind, then that would be of great benefit. And so that even though they're just living very quietly in to themselves. This was very much Anuruddha's personality. He was just a contemplative type. He would stay in the monastery and meditate. And others like Sariputta or Ananda and so on would be doing the teaching and things. The Buddha never said that, well, that's selfish or you should be doing this. He never said he was always very respectful of the different people's personalities. Even one case where another case in the Vinaya where there's somebody who was a student of Anuruddha's I think it was in an argument with somebody who was a student of Ananda's or something like that. And this sort of came to the attention of the Buddha, and the Buddha said to Ananda, he said, well, look, when was the last time that Anuruddha got involved in the affairs of the Sangha? He said that's not his role. Yeah? So don't expect him to come and solve this problem. This is something that you should look at. And so the Buddha just respected everybody for what they could contribute. And actually, you actually find a strong respect for and celebration of diversity within the Sangha. Another sutta set in that same grove, actually, called the Mahagosinga Sutta. The monks were sitting around there meditating, and they said, "What kind of monk would illuminate this Jeta's grove? Not this Jeta grove, this Gosinga grove, Gosinga Vana." And Venerable Sariputta said, if there was a monk meditating here who had great wisdom, he would illuminate that grove. And the Venerable Moggallana says, if the monk had great psychic powers, then he would illuminate his grove. And Mahakassapa says, if a monk was really good at keeping the ascetic practices, then he would illuminate his grove. And Anuruddha says, if a monk was very good at the divine eye, then he could be. And Ananda said, if somebody was really good at the suttas, then he would illuminate this grove. And so after they had that discussion, they went to see the Buddha, and they told him what the Buddha, and the Buddha said, that's wonderful. Sariputta said that because that's what he's good at. Yeah? Moggallana said that because that's what he's good at. Yeah? And he's actually, they were celebrating the strengths that each of the members of the Sangha had. And the Buddha's not like, you're just puffing yourself up, right? But you actually, it's like very healthy and wholesome. You recognize that these are actually those good qualities. And then the Buddha said, but I think you've all spoken well, and all those monks would indeed illuminate that Gosinga grove. But listen now to who I think would illuminate the Gosinga grove. It's very interesting, the difference between the Buddha and all the great disciples, right? So all of these great disciples, all of them have spoken about themselves, right? And all of them have spoken about somebody who's, in a sense, accomplished. Yeah. So if you were to follow on from that pattern, of course, the Buddha would say, if a Buddha was to sit in that grove, then that would illuminate, right? But he doesn't say that at all. He doesn't talk about the Buddha. He doesn't even talk about an arahant. Right? He's not talking about someone who's accomplished. The Buddha said, somebody who sits in that grove to meditate, to think, I will strive to overcome my defilements, yeah? And I will keep on meditating and practicing until I have realized enlightenment. That is somebody who will illuminate the grove. Yeah? So the Buddha's pointing to the cause. Yeah, he's pointing to the path and not to the fruit. Yeah, very interesting difference, isn't it? Yeah, and so that's where again that a wonderful quality that the Buddha has. Anyway, so the Buddha, after staying there for a while with the Anuruddha and his friends, moved on and went back to Savatthi, and so the monks back in Kosambi were still fighting and so on, and then after a while they came to their senses, and the monk who'd been accused of committing an offence by leaving the water dipper out said, no, that probably was an offence after all, now that I think about it. And so they all come to Savatthi, and the problem's not really kind of resolved, and so when they're coming, all of the different people come to see the Buddha to ask what they should do, right? So all these monks are disputing, and so like Sariputta comes and says, well, what should we do? And the Buddha said, well, you should receive them all with kindness and respect, and you should assign them separate lodgings. Yeah, right? And don't refuse anybody requisites or anything like that, but give them separate lodgings. Hopefully they can work it out. Then the lay people come and say, what should we do about these guys, right? So the Buddha doesn't say, don't give them any food or only give them the bad stuff. He says just give dana and be generous to everybody. But when you listen to the Dhamma, then you should discern who's teaching Dhamma and who's teaching what is not Dhamma. Yeah? So again, very interesting distinction that he makes, right? In terms of generosity and kindness, you're just kind to everybody. Yeah? You don't worry about it. Yeah? But in terms of Dhamma, then you need to use your wisdom and your discernment. And you see who's actually practicing Dhamma, and then you listen to them. Similarly, Mahapajapati came and asked, and he gave similar advice to her about how the bhikkhunis should behave and relate to the different groups of monks. So, and eventually they did come to their senses and they asked for forgiveness, and the whole matter was settled. And so this is also something which I think is such a powerful thing in Buddhism, that these conflicts, they can always be settled. Right? The word for settling them, right, is samatha. Right? So we're used to hearing the word samatha in meditation. It means tranquility. Yeah? But the word samatha is a legal term. Right? It means the settling of a dispute. So if you have a legal case, in Pali is called an adhikarana, and a settling of a legal case is adhikarana samatha. Yeah? And so the Buddha gave 7 means of settling an adhikarana. Okay, so 7 adhikarana samatha, and these 7 adhikarana samatas are absolutely foundational to the Vinaya. Okay, and these are for any kind of issue, any kind of problem or issue that arises in the Sangha, in the Vinaya, then one or other of these 7 adhikarana samatas applies, and these are found across all traditions, every Vinaya, in an absolutely identical form. So they're a very fundamental part of the Vinaya. Samukha Vinaya Databo. Samukha means in the presence of. Okay, so this is the first one, in the presence of. So that means that if there's any dispute, that each person who's a party to that dispute has to be present. Okay, but there's the presence of 3 things. First of all, the parties who relevant for the dispute have to be present. Secondly, it has to be in the presence of the Sangha. Okay, so the community has to be present. And thirdly, it has to be in presence of the Dhamma. Okay, so you have to actually do all of the proceedings in accordance with the Dhamma. And if it's not done in accordance with the Dhamma, then it doesn't satisfy that. And that's the first and the most basic of all the adhikarana samatas, which applies to everything that happens in the Vinaya. Okay, so every Vinaya procedure must include Samukha Vinaya, so in the presence of. Samukha Vinaya, I'll see if I can remember these. Samukha Vinaya Databo, Sati Vinaya. Sati is a more specialized one. In this case, it means an accurate memory. So if somebody accuses you of something, and you say, I remember what happened, I know what happened, and that's not what happened, then that's enough to settle the dispute. So there's a sense of trusting. Like if somebody says, this is my memory, they have a clear memory. Amulha means not crazy. And what it means is when somebody's basically has been crazy in the past and isn't anymore. Okay, so you essentially get a blanket excuse for all Vinaya offences if you're mad. Yeah. So you can do anything you like while you're mad, and it doesn't count. Yeah. Again, which is quite forward thinking, right? I mean, what exactly mad means is not really defined, but it seems to be a psychotic break from the way it's described. I said and did many things that I can't remember and I don't know, and it's like a temporary episode and they recover from it. So it sounds like a psychotic break. It's not talking about someone suffering from depression or a bit of anxiety, or so therefore you can escape from doing keeping the Vinaya rules, but you're really nuts. So Amula Vinaya. Yeah.
So you're allowed to ordain. The Buddha said you can ordain if you're completely mad.
No. This is an episode that happens to somebody who's already ordained.
Oh.
Yeah. So they go mad. They do all kinds of unseemly things, and then afterwards they say, "How I was mad. I can't remember what I was doing." Sati Vinaya Dapo Patinyata Karanam. Tasapapiyasika. Tasapapiyasika is a determination of habitual bad character. So this is a kind of when if somebody brings an accusation, and if there's for example, when Sariputta was accused of being of evil wishes by Kokalika, who is one of the disciples of Devadatta, then many monks could testify to the fact that this monk was a bad character and hang around with bad friends, and so that was a way of settling the dispute, because that monk couldn't be trusted. Yebuyasika is a majority, okay? So a decision made by majority, and decisions made by majority is actually very unusual in the Vinaya, okay? Almost all decisions in the Vinaya are done by consensus, so that means everybody has to agree, and if even one person objects, then it doesn't go through. Okay, it's very important. This again is this kind of flatness of the Vinaya which was set up by the Buddha. Every Sangha member has equal say in any Sangha act, but there are certain limited circumstances where the Sangha can make a decision to make a choice by majority. Right, so the Sangha in consensus has to agree to make a majority decision. Okay, so there's still a consensus behind there, but you agree to accept the majority. And it's actually quite sophisticated how it's done. It goes into some details of allocating tally sticks, whether it has to be a hidden ballot or whether it can be open or it has to be secret, and allocating sticks and how they're to be counted and so on and so forth. So it goes into there's quite a sophisticated democratic process for that. Tinawatarako is, and the last one is, I think I've got most of them anyway. The last one is covering over with grass. Okay, and so that's what happens when there's lots of problems and disputes and lots of accusations on every side, right? And if you're going to try to get to the bottom of all of it, you're just going to spend too much time and dredging up too much stuff. So rather than trying to get to the bottom of it, everybody agrees we'll just cover it over with grass. Okay, just cover it over, just let it be. Yeah? And that's especially if there's lots of kind of minor niggling allegations and things like that. You just cover it over with grass, but don't worry about it. So again, that's just a quick kind of summary of some of the methods that's found in the Vinaya. But again, this is an expression of the Buddha's character, how he went about solving problems. He didn't want to solve problems through the power of his charisma. Right? And so one of the things which the texts are admitting is that even the Buddha's charisma is not enough. Right? Even though no one's questioning the Buddha's motives or his integrity or any of those things, but still that is not enough to actually solve all of these problems. Yeah? And so he instituted these processes. Right? He used his charisma wisely, right? Not in order to control others, but in order to empower others. Right? That's the mark of a true leader, right? Rather than a ruler, right? A ruler is somebody who says, do this or else, right? And this is based on power, right? Leader is somebody who inspires others. He makes them want to do it, yeah? He brings out the best in people. And so the Buddha was always looking what's on the positive side of people. What's the best quality that this person has, yeah? What's the best quality that they have? I remember we had this time when I was in Bodhinyana many years ago, and we had this fellow who came and stayed in the monastery, and this fellow was a complete nightmare, right? He'd been kicked out of just about every monastery in Australia, and he was just terrible. And he was loud and crude and obnoxious, and he would hit on the girls who came to the monastery, and he was just a pig, honestly. And we kind of tried to tolerate him and so on, and you try to put up with him, and oh God. And then he kind of left and went back, and then he writes this letter saying, oh, can you give me a job reference? Right? That's to Ajahn Brahm. Right? And we were kind of laughing and stuff, and right? And Ajahn Brahm, he's completely unfazed by that, and he wrote a job reference which was totally positive and totally true. Right? And he pointed out all these good qualities of that person, which actually were all, okay, that's actually quite true. Actually, he was quite intelligent, yeah. And he actually did have all these good qualities, and he was actually quite helpful in many things, and so it really showed, and to him, that was so, for Ajahn Brahm, that was so natural. That's just the way he sees everybody. Yeah? And so and I think the Buddha was very much the same. Just the idea of just to keep on bringing out that what's the best in people. And so this is why he set up that system. He set up the Vinaya. His purpose of it is to strengthen those good qualities which every person has inside them. Even like Devadatta, I mean, obviously you reach a point where, no, sorry, you can't do it anymore. Right? But even him, for such a long time, the Buddha was forgiving and he was accepting and he was allowing. And so this to me is one of the most beautiful things about the Sangha. And I think it's also one of the most powerful things about the Sangha. Why has the Sangha lasted for such a long time? Right? Why is the Sangha so resilient? It's because we're not going around trying to control everybody. You're not trying to force everybody into a mold. And if you live in Sangha communities, you see that there's this huge amount of diversity. And of course, Sangha communities vary a lot, and some of them are better than others, and so on and so forth. But there's always this kind of tolerance and respect for people who are different, people who, don't fit in, and that recognition that we should be celebrating the strengths of people rather than trying to sort of force them into some kind of mould. Anyway, so that's just sort of wandering off the topic a little bit there, but anyway, that's some thoughts on the Buddha and how he lived together with the community. And I was thinking about it from my own point of view of living in the monk's life, but I also, comes back to those things that I talked about at the beginning of this evening when, just to remember with gratitude, that we have a community here and that all the people here are part of it. Many people who are not here are also part of it. And we're a kind of weird community and we live in very different places and come from different backgrounds. And, without having the chance to have these talks and this time to come together, we might not for a while, right? So that's kind of okay. But I think it's good to keep in touch and to try to maybe arrange some events and some occasions to be able to come together and maybe do some practice, or even just to come together and meet up once in a while.